I, as you know, preach systematically through books of the Bible. I've been trained to do this for nigh on to 30 years now. That's what I do. I just open a book up and just work through it at whatever pace the Lord would have me to work through it. Sometimes faster, sometimes slower. It depends just on how much I think I can get across on any given Sunday, right? I mean, there comes a point when you have to stop. And I've always believed that preaching systematically through books of the Bible works. I think people understand the totality of the book and the whole counsel of God sort of things. And so I've always done it this way. It just makes it easier for me. I don't have big questions as to what I'm going to preach on next. I just open the Bible to the next, whatever the next words are, because I'm lazy, you know. But there are some problems with preaching systematically through books. One of the problems is that sometimes you come across a passage of Scripture that's difficult to understand. It's difficult to interpret. It's difficult to you go study the original language underneath the verse and you try to figure out what it means. It's hard to interpret, or sometimes it's a passage that appears irrelevant to a modern audience, and so you look at it and go, what am I going to do with this? But when you preach systematically, this forces you to deal with it. You don't just get to skip over it. You have to actually go and understand what it says and try to help the people who are listening to you understand it. And now, that's not the case this morning. That's not the case this morning. The passage we're going to look at this morning is actually very easy to understand. But a second issue of systematic preaching, another problem that you discover is that sometimes you're forced to preach passages that are difficult to apply. Meaning that you're looking at a passage of Scripture and then you look out at the audience that's facing you and recognize these people really need to hear this. It's difficult to apply in the sense that you know that there's something going on in the lives of your people or in the lives of your church, and the passage deals specifically with it, and you have to be the one to stand up in front of them and say to them, this is what the Bible says to you. Now, of course, that applies to me as well. Every passage does that for me, by the way. Well, how does this apply to us? Sometimes it's difficult to do that. Passages that directly impact the life of the church. And preaching systematically then doesn't allow you to just skip over it and go, well, I'll just avoid that subject because it might offend somebody or hurt somebody's feelings or whatever in the congregation. You actually have to be aware of such realities, and you have to also, in the process, of course, seek the wisdom of God as to how to say these things in a way that your people will respond to it. Now, that's not the case in this verse this morning. This is not a passage of Scripture we're going to look at this morning that I'm going to look at you and say, you have a problem here. Okay, let me be clear about that, okay? This is not a passage that I'm going to say, you people really need to do something. No, not at all. There's always application of a text, of course, in some way. But this is not one of those cases where I have to confront you or scold you or rebuke you. But there is a third problem with preaching systematically. Sometimes you're forced to preach passages that are directly related to you as a preacher. Every once in a while, it's pretty rare, fortunately, especially if you're working in the New Testament, but every once in a while you actually have to preach a passage of Scripture to your people that involves who you are as a preacher, what you do as a preacher. Now, I don't mean in that second sense where you have to look at me and say, hey, preacher, you're sinning. Now, that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a particular situation where your job description is in the verse, and you have to preach to the people about what you do and what you're supposed to be doing and how they're supposed to react to it. What does it mean to be a preacher? Sometimes verses come up like this. Now, I realize this method of preaching systematically, again, can't skip over it, right? It would be easy to do it here. This would be one of those places it would be easy just to kind of say, okay, I'm just going to skip right over this and move on, but I can't do that if I'm going to be consistent. I mean, after all, if I'm going to rebuke you every once in a while, it's only fair that... Well, the fact of the matter is that you have to be self-aware once in a while, okay? Sometimes in the irony of the Spirit of God, you have to be self-aware of what it means to do the job of being a teaching elder. And it also, of course, helps your people and understand the realities of the ministry. Sometimes it's necessary for us to say, okay, let's talk about this thing called teaching elder. What does that really mean? What's that all about? So we have a full and complete and rounded understanding of that. So that leads us this morning to 1 Timothy 5. 1 Timothy chapter 5, and we're going to be looking today at just verses 17 and 18. Just those two verses, because there's a thought in there that needs to be addressed. Now let me just remind you where we're at in 1 Timothy 5. Paul has pivoted into more specifically practical matters now. We saw it starting at the beginning of chapter 5. We saw it to some extent in chapter 4, but he's really pivoted very strongly in chapter 5 from certain to more specifically practical matters. Remember, we looked at this whole issue of conflict. What's going to happen when Timothy does his job? And he's going to have to actually go and rebuke people in the church. How should he do that? Remember, treating the whole issue of family and understanding one another in the role of family. Then secondly, we looked at the whole issue of benevolence. We talked a great deal about this widow's list from verse 3 to verse 16 and the whole reality that Paul needs to be aware of this as he does his job, as a part of doing this job. Just as an aside, by the way, this week I received 2 calls for help related to paying utility bills. Remember I pointed that out last week? I got 2 of them this week, so they continue to come in all the time. Now, Paul is going to turn to issues of leadership that Timothy will need to be aware of and deal with over the course of his job. If he's going to do his job, he needs to be doing it in a way in which he is relating to leadership in the church properly. And so this is where Paul goes. Now, let's look at verses 17 and 18. As Paul has pivoted to this issue of leadership, he says this, "Let the elders who rule well be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in preaching and teaching. For the scripture says, quote, 'You shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain,' unquote. And, quote, 'the laborer deserves his wages,' unquote." All right, so let's look at these 2 verses. We have already discussed eldership in terms of what elders are. We did that, remember, back in chapter 3. We talked about elders as a plurality of men from within the local church who are charged with the spiritual oversight of the flock. A group of men who guide the church as shepherds towards greater spiritual maturity. Now you'll notice a couple of key points in there. It's a plurality of elders, multiple men that are set aside to this role. They're part of the local church. They come out of the very congregation itself. They have the responsibility of spiritual oversight primarily over the lives of the congregation. That's the eldership. Now, we've already, as I said, defined all of that back in chapter 3 when Paul laid out the qualifications for elders in the first 7 verses of that chapter. And you recall that one of the things we pointed out is that this is a group of men accountable for the souls of the congregation. This is a group of men accountable, that's a key word, accountable for the souls of the congregation. The writer of Hebrews puts it this way in his letter, chapter 13, verse 17. "Obey your leaders and submit to them, for they are keeping watch over your souls, as those who will have to give an account. Let them do it with joy and not with groaning, for that would be of no advantage to you." And when we talked about this whole issue back in December of last year, we pointed out that this is a group of men responsible for the spiritual well-being of the people of the church. However, what Paul does here is he adds some finesse, okay? He adds some finesse to the issue of eldership here. You might argue that in chapter 3, he gives the qualifications, and then over here, he adds a bit of finesse to that to make sure it's understood what that really means for the congregation as they understand the issue of leadership. Now, I want to pause for a moment here and ask a question. Does Paul here intimate that there are multiple classes of elder in the church? Does he seem to say here that there are those who rule and those who do not? or those who have some sort of authority and those who do not. I mean, he uses the term rule, the elders who rule well. The implication might be, well, let the elders who rule well is one category, and then let the elders who don't rule be another category. So he could, some have suggested that's what he's saying. And there are some denominations who do see such a difference. There are some denominations, for example, who understand the concept of a ruling elder, a teaching elder, and just your ordinary class of elder. I don't even know what adjective I would use to describe them, right? Normal elders, right? I don't know. In some denominations, even you have the perspective of elders who live more at a higher level, a presbytery level, versus those in the local body who are just local. So there's these different kinds of classes that some denominations have built. Can you draw that conclusion from this verse? And I believe the answer is no. I don't think you can. It is unlikely, in fact, that Paul is distinguishing between different classes of elder here. So let me give you some reasons why I think so. Number one, there's no class or type distinctions for elders ever mentioned back in chapter 3 or in Titus 1, the other passage having to do with eldership. Paul never mentions any sort of distinction in those verses when he qualifies elders. You would think that if Paul expected there to be different classes of elders, he'd have mentioned it at the point where he talks about their qualifications, because there's likely to be very different qualifications between those who are in a so-called ruling class versus those who are not, one would think. But he does not. Secondly, the word that's translated rule in the ESV is a word that can actually be translated manage, or lead, or even devote themselves. In fact, if you go back to 1 Timothy 3 and you look at verse 4, verse 5, and verse 12, the word appears there. And in those cases, it is translated by the ESV as manage. Verse 4, he must manage his own household. Verse 5, for someone does not know how to manage his own household. One of the things I dislike about some modern translations, including the ESV, is that it's not consistent with its use of words. If you're going to take a Greek word and use it, why not use it in the same translation in each case? This, I think, is better. Let the elders who manage well be considered worthy. If that is, in fact, the way the word is to be used, then that sort of removes this distinction class, doesn't it? It's not about rulers versus non-rulers. It's about people who manage or do their job well. Thirdly, the word especially, right? Let the elders who rule well be considered worthy of double honor, especially those, implies that those who, quote unquote, labor in preaching and teaching are a subset of the larger body of elders, right? He seems to say there's a group of elders who rule well, especially. That word especially puts them into the category of the ones he's speaking up above. So Paul is saying those who labor in preaching and teaching are simply a subset of the larger body of elders. So in other words, the distinction is between their efforts, not their class. Their efforts, not their position. Fourthly, the construction of the entire sentence indicates that Paul was distinguishing between elders who rule, and here's the key word, well, versus those who do not. So it's not a distinction of position, it's a distinction of a quality of effort. Those who rule well versus those who do not rule well. That's the key phrase, I think, that tells what it is that Paul's trying to say here. Paul says there will be elders who will manage, who will lead, who will put themselves in positions of authority and do what they're supposed to do, devoting themselves to the work. There will be those who do that well, and then, of course, there will be some who don't. And so those who don't are not worthy of the double honor. And then finally, number 5, and this, of course, I always come back to this, the context of these verses seems to suggest that what Paul's really going to go after here is distinguishing between elders who hold their role in holiness versus those who are found to be sinful and thus ineffective. In fact, I think you could make a pretty good argument that all that Paul is really going to get at starts in verse 19, when he starts speaking about the charge against an elder. Verse 20, those who persist in sin. In verse 21, keep these rules without be judging, do not be hasty. Verse 24, the sins of some are conspicuous. All of that has to do with elders. So the real distinction that Paul is going to make here is those who rule well, those who manage well because their focus is on holiness and godliness and pursuing after the things of Christ in obedience and loyalty and submission, versus those who are found to be sinful, thus being unable to manage well. The distinction then for Paul isn't a distinction of class, those who rule versus those who do not, but rather those who are part of the eldership whose pursuit is the pursuit of their own holiness, which flows over into the holiness of their congregation, versus those whose focus is sinful and selfish, which obviously does not flow over into the life of the congregation. I think Paul here is not suggesting that there are multiple classes of elder at all, but rather classes of sin versus non-sin in the life of the elders. Paul insists here, you will see, that the church must give double honor to those who lead and guide the flock effectively. To give double honor to those who lead and guide the flock effectively, because that is what the church is all about. Godliness and holiness is what the church is all about. This may come as a bit of a shock to you, but the church is not about meeting your material needs or physical needs. It's not really even about meeting your spiritual needs. It's about the pursuit of holiness. It's about the pursuit of godliness. It's about the pursuit of a life lived into utter submission and obedience to this Christ, who we trust has led us into the presence of God by his sacrificial work. We believe the promises of God, and we want to do all that he has commanded us to do. We've had that heart of stone taken out and a new heart put in, and that new heart has the law of God written on it, a law which means we love to serve this Christ in holiness and obedience. When Paul suggests that the elders are to be men who lead and guide the flock effectively, and we give double honor to them who do, it's because that's what the church is all about. We don't give double honor to the guys who are really smart in the business world. Give double honor to the guys who put their whole lives into the process of leading us as a people into greater and greater conformity with the image of Christ. Because that's what the church is all about. And so Paul says these men are worthy of double honor because it should be the natural desire, key words, natural desire of the people of God to honor those who have been called by Christ to aid them in this growth. It should be the natural desire of a people to say, we see these men called by God, set apart by him to lead us to godliness, and our desire is to give them honor because that's what they're doing. Because that's what we want them to do. To recognize their importance in spiritual matters. In other words, it's what Paul says when he means double honor here. It's not just honoring them for holding the title. Whenever you see an elder in the hallway, you reach for his hand and kiss his ring because he's someone important and special and of high authority, right? No, that's not what it means. But honoring them for doing well the work of spiritual discipline, being trustworthy to lead us to Christ likeness. We give them double honor. We give them double honor because we recognize their work will be difficult. It'll be difficult. Shepherding sheep is hard work. We double honor them because we honor their effort to fight our resistance. Because that's what we are. We're resistant. We're like sheep. It's a perfect analogy, by the way. If you've ever been around sheep, they're not only dumb animals, but they're stubborn as well. The fact of the matter is that's exactly what the people, even those who have been born again by the Spirit of God, can be at times. Resistant. We give double honor to those men who lay down their lives like shepherds do as under shepherds of the church to lead a people to Christ, to holiness. And it's important that we give them that double honor because we send a message to them. That's what we want. And even if we're resistant, do it. Lead us to this Christ. Which leads Paul to say then the harder part of this. That was all easy to preach, by the way. The next part, not so much. He adds this word especially. Okay? Especially. If I ever get a chance to talk to Paul, we're going to sit down, we're going to talk about this use of this word. Especially those who labor in preaching and teaching. Okay. Now, here's where Paul is going to go with this. Part of the double honor, Paul says, is to compensate those who labor in preaching and teaching. Notice the phrase, labor in preaching and teaching. It would appear that Paul considered full-time compensated teaching elders to be a normal part of the polity of the church. Paul considered the idea of paying men to serve as full-time compensated elders to be the normal polity of a church. Polity, by the way, means its structure, its government. How the church is organized is its polity. From the very earliest time, it would appear that Paul considered there to be some amongst the elders. Notice he puts them in the elder category, right? Those who are elders who labor in preaching and teaching. Those men are to be compensated for their work. Now, let's talk about this idea of compensation. There are many who would argue today that there is no need for compensation for full-time teaching elders. And in fact, it's actually growing in popularity. And part of what's going on is as the church itself is shrinking in size due to this massive secularization that's going on around us, churches themselves are finding themselves in financial straits in which they're now actually making the reverse argument simply because of the economics of it. Well, we don't need to pay a minister. And the argument goes something like this. Well, no minister should actually be compensated, or maybe we'll just give them a stipend, a mild compensation. Because all Christians are designated under the Holy Spirit as ministers, and if the work of the church were equally spread out amongst all the believers, there would be no or little need for paid leadership. In other words, if we all did our jobs the way we're supposed to do, then there wouldn't be any need for paying someone to preach and teach. Now, that seems like a really appealing argument, doesn't it? Hey, look, if we just spread the work around, then we won't need a full-time minister to actually to teach to us. And they would make the argument this way. They would say, well, look at the church in Acts 2. Look at the church in Acts 2, right? Everybody had everything in common. They were a communal group of people. It was informal. There were no church rolls, right? There were no membership lists. There were no compensated leaders. There was none of those kinds of things existed. And so we should go back to that model. In fact, a lot of churches are doing that. They're going back to this primitive church model. Let's try to build ourselves in this primitive church model. And they would say, well, look at Paul. Paul was a tent maker. He didn't take a full-time compensation. He didn't take a full-time compensation. He worked as a tent maker alongside Priscilla and Aquila in order to earn a living while he was in Corinth, and he didn't take a full-time compensation. So we should use him as a model, right? And then, of course, the third argument is the argument that often comes up when it comes to these kinds of matters, and that is, well, you know what kind of effect money has had in the church down through time. You know what happens when you pay ministers? They just get lazy, and they start assuming an entitlement mentality, and all kinds of problems come in. I mean, think of what Peter said in 1 Peter 5:2, this whole issue of filthy lucre. Men doing it for the filthy lucre. I just love that phrase from the King James. Filthy lucre. And so they would argue, they would say, look, there should be no compensation going on because, we don't really need it. We should just model ourselves after the early church, model ourselves after Paul himself, and just get rid of all the problems related to money. If we can just do that, then this problem will go away. How do we respond to that? There are, in fact, some logical responses against that can be made. There's a flawed presupposition, of course, in this argument that all ministry is equal in effort. That all ministry is equal in effort. That preaching and teaching is just another ministry like any other. So if you're the janitor, it's equal in effort to preaching the word. Now, how many of you believe that? See, there are some who do. I would call that a naive position. Not to say I'm not taking anything away from those who do the janitorial work, not at all. It's an important ministry. But there's clearly a difference in effort between the two. The high view of preaching that Paul seems to have in this passage here, as well back in chapter 3, verse 17, is the idea that Paul considered this work to be important enough that it should be high in the minds of the congregation as a ministry. He doesn't see it as equal to all other ministries. He sees a difference in it. Secondly, there's a flaw. The contention that the infant church of Acts 2 is the superior model is a flawed contention. How do I know that? I just have to read the rest of the book of Acts. That same church needed deacons by the time you get to Acts 6, and that same church needed elders by the time you get to Acts 15. So yes, we can model ourselves after Acts 2, but eventually we're going to run into the need for leadership to take care of issues. I mean, we just preached through a whole issue related to the widow's list. As Paul is teaching the church, he's giving them instructions on how to deal with this matter, which he's assuming is going to be handled by the ministry of mercy, otherwise known as the deacon. So to go back to the Acts 2 model is to take a very primitive view as though you're ignoring the rest of the New Testament, which you can't do. And then the assumption that Paul was some sort of example for us to follow is a flawed assumption. Why? Because Paul was never an elder. He was not a member of the local congregation. Paul was an itinerant missionary apostle. He went to a place, he preached the gospel, he taught for a while, and what did he do? He left and went on to someplace else. He was not a model for eldership because he was not a permanent fixture in any of the churches he was in. And everybody knew it. Everybody knew it. So this idea that you can equalize all effort and follow the pattern of the first century, the very early primitive church, and then use Paul as an example really doesn't hold water, doesn't stand up to examination. There's biblical support for this idea of teacher-elder compensation. And I want to take you to 1 Corinthians 9. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Now, why am I going there? Why am I going to 1 Corinthians 9? Why am I jumping out of this passage? I mean, aren't you expositors supposed to stay in the passage you're in and make the point? Yeah. But in 1 Corinthians 9:9, Paul quotes the exact same verse he quotes here in 1 Timothy 5:18. In other words, he goes and explains what he means. So in other words, what we can do is we can break out of 1 Timothy 5 here to go back and see what we've done before, which is to step back from Paul's worldview, step back from Paul's immediate view to Paul's worldview. How did Paul think in the larger sense? This is why he writes what he does in 1 Corinthians 9. And you know that the book of 1 Corinthians is written as this massive dialogue to a local church about all their problems that needed to be addressed. All right, so here we go. Here's one of them. Now, let me put before you a thesis that Paul brings out in these verses, specifically verses 1 to 14. The church is commanded to fully compensate the elders who preach full time, and it should desire to do so with great generosity because it honors the gospel of grace. You with me? Okay, let's look at what he says. Now, I'm not going to do an individual word-by-word exegesis of the passage. We're just going to skim through this pretty quick. In verses 1 and 2, as Paul's writing, his authority is being questioned. His authority is being questioned. And he begins to write a number of rhetorical questions about his own position. Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? He starts to defend his position in terms of who he was as he walked into the church at Corinth. It was being questioned. And what specifically he's being questioned about is the fact that he did not act as other leaders in the church had been acting. His ministry seemed to be different. And he made some decisions along the way that he felt were right, which is what he says in verses 3 through 6. Paul admits that he made certain decisions, which was his absolute right to do. He had the right as an apostle of the Lord Jesus Christ to walk into the church and make certain decisions about how he was going to operate. Notice what he says in verse 3. This is my defense to those who would examine me. He says, do we not have the right to eat and drink? Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord, and Peter, Cephas? Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living? Are we the only ones that must do this or must not do this in terms of compensation? So he had made some decisions, and one of the decisions that he had made was to not accept any compensation, although he had a right to it. I have a right to this, Paul says, but I chose not to. All right, he'll explain why as you get later in the chapter. But from the outset, he says, listen, as an apostle, I have a right to make some decisions when it comes to this matter of compensation, receiving compensation for the work that I'm doing. In verses 7 to 12, then Paul lays out his first biblical argument as to why teaching elders ought to be paid. More specifically, his right to compensation. Why does Paul have a right to compensation? Okay, so he lays out his first argument. Notice what he says. Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard without eating any of its fruit? I mean, if you plant some fruit trees in your yard and they grow, do you not have a right to pick the fruit and eat it? Who tends a flock without getting some of the milk? Do I say these things on human authority? Does the law not say the same? For it is written in the law of Moses. Notice the quote. You shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. Okay, that's the exact same quote as we see in 1 Timothy 5. Does he not certainly, is it for oxen that God is concerned? Is God worried about the ox here? No. He says, does he not certainly speak for our sake? It was written for our sake, because the plowman should plow in hope that he gets to join, that the thresher threshes in hope of sharing in the crop. If we have sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? If others share this rightful claim on you, do we not even more? See, notice the argument. Paul is saying, listen, this quote from Deuteronomy 25, that the ox has a right to eat some of the grain that he treads out, is similar to all these other examples that he gives, right? He gives a number of them. Soldiers, vineyard planters, farmers, plowmen, threshers, all these various kinds of people who work in various ways all benefit from the work they do in sowing and planting. When the farmer plants a crop, he expects to eat it. Or he expects to at least benefit from whatever he gets by selling it to someone else, or if he's sharecropping, whatever he's paid to do that work. He expects to benefit from doing so. He's not planting a garden or planting a field and then never getting anything out of it. Paul says that's ridiculous. Now, quickly back to 1 Timothy 5. You'll notice also in verse 18 that Paul adds a quote here. In 1 Timothy 5, Paul adds a quote. And if you're using a modern red letter Bible, it's in red letters, because it's actually a quote from Jesus himself. It comes out of Matthew 10:10. Paul quotes Jesus there when in Matthew 10, Jesus is sending out his disciples to go into the local villages with the gospel. They had reached a point in the ministry there where Jesus felt like he could send out his disciples, his apostles, to go out into the various villages and to preach the gospel. And he says to them, when you do, don't take anything from the people there except food. Let them feed you, but don't take anything else from them. Okay? Paul, as you'll notice, he puts the quote here, Paul interprets that to mean that those who preach the gospel should expect compensation. See it? Paul says, Jesus said, the laborer deserves his wages. I understand that, Paul speaking here, I understand that to mean the same thing that God himself said in Deuteronomy 25. Those who preach the gospel deserve to be compensated for doing so. Okay? So Paul's first argument, back to 1 Corinthians 9, is that there is a right to compensation for those who do this work. There's a right for that. Now, in verse 13 then, Paul lays out his second biblical argument. He gives one, which is sort of a general logical argument that can be found in the law of God, but then he turns in verse 13 when he says, "Do you not know that those who are employed in the temple service get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in the sacrificial offerings?" He goes back to the law and he says, remember that in the temple, those priests who serve for you in bringing your sacrifice, guess what they get to do? They get to eat of your sacrifice. The law provided specific provisions for the priests. Remember, the Levites did not have land of their own. They were not given a parcel in ancient Israel as their own. They were scattered by God amongst all the other peoples, and they would serve as the priests. And the peoples would come and bring their sacrifices, and the Levitical priests would be supported by the giving of these sacrifices. So Paul's argument is, listen, even the priests understand this. Now, I think the reason why Paul uses this second argument is because it becomes quite specific. Your religious leaders of the past, those people who served you in the temple, the religious service, they got their support from those they were serving. It's a very obvious argument. God had established a precedent in the compensation of the Levitical priesthood. But now read verse 14. Probably the most specific and explicit way Paul could say this. In the same way, meaning in the same way of all of those who plant a garden and get food from it, all of those who serve in the temple, in the same way, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. Notice what Paul does. He states the command outright. The church is commanded by the Lord to fully compensate those who proclaim the gospel. Or, as he says in 1 Timothy 5, those who labor in the preaching and teaching ministries. So Paul lays this out. The church is commanded to fully compensate the elders who preach full time. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it in 1 Corinthians 9, and I think he makes exactly the same argument in 1 Timothy 5, just in much shorter language. The elders who rule well, especially those who preach and teach, they're worthy of a double honor, and here's why. Okay? Now, the importance of this then is what really matters. The importance of this is what really matters. First question I would ask here, why did Paul refuse compensation even though it was his right? Because the natural, obvious question you might ask then is, well, if Paul didn't take any compensation, why should anybody else, right? Okay, so why did Paul refuse the compensation even though it was his right? Now go to verse 15 then of 1 Corinthians 9. But I've made no use of any of these rights, nor am I writing these things to secure any provision. For I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of my ground for boasting. For if I preach the gospel that gives me no ground for boasting, for necessity is laid upon me. In other words, I've got to do this. I've been commanded to do this. For if I do this out of my own will, I have a reward. But if not of my own will, I am still entrusted with a stewardship. In other words, what Paul says is he refused to receive compensation in order to have something to boast in. Specifically, the ability to boast in his obedience. And we mean boast in the positive sense here, okay? The word boast can have a positive connotation. I have something that I'm proud of. I'm not proud of it in the negative, sinful sense. I'm proud of it in the sense that I'm being obedient to this Christ. I'm doing what I've been commanded to do. I don't have any choice in the matter. Christ himself met me on the road to Damascus, converted my entire existence. I spent 14 years in Tarsus figuring out how this all works, and then he set me loose in Asia Minor and Greece to preach this. And that's what I got to do. I don't have a choice. So I'm able to boast in the fact that I'm preaching the gospel. That's more important to me than the compensation. But that leads him to a second point. He refused the compensation, not just so he could boast in his obedience, but because it demonstrated something to the church. It demonstrated something to the church. And what did it demonstrate? Verse 18. What then is my reward? What's the reward of doing this? That in my preaching I may present the gospel free of charge, so as to not make full use of my right in the gospel. Them receiving something for free is mirrored in Paul giving them something for free. Them receiving something for free is mirrored in Paul giving them something for free. What is Paul doing? Paul comes to this very infant church at Corinth, preaches the gospel to them. It's a gospel of free grace. It's a free gift of God. Receive this great salvation for no payment. It doesn't cost you a thing. It's simply believe, trust in this Christ. So I'm not going to take any compensation in order to make that point. I want you to receive it from me for free so that you understand its freedom. That's where Paul goes. He says, I'm not accepting the compensation because I want the church to understand something. So here's the irony of it. Paul says, those who preach and labor in the gospel, you should compensate them. I didn't accept the compensation to make a point with you about free grace, but now it flips over on you. Now it flips over on you. Going forward from here, right? Paul's writing from a distance here. He's writing back to this church and he's saying, listen, I want you to understand something. I came to you to give you a gospel of grace, and I demonstrated it by not accepting any compensation. Your response is to compensate those who continue to preach that gospel to you because you understand the message that I brought to you. Why should the church desire to be generous in the support of its teaching elders? Why? Why should the church be generous in the support of its teaching elders? Because it is the natural response of a people who have received a free gift from God. Why? Why should any of us give to the church? Not just to pay my salary, but for any of the ministries that we do. Why? Is it because there's some sort of Old Testament obligation that sits over us? There are many who think that way. There are many who would say, yes, 10%. That's what the law says, give your 10%. But that's not what the New Testament says. Paul says a man should give what he has decided in his heart to give. And his generosity should be a picture of his understanding of the concept of grace. If you understand the concept of the fact that you have received an infinite grace of God, then how will you respond to that? What will be your natural response to that? The generosity of the people of God is based on their understanding of this free gift from God. Let me give you a contra example. There's an old adage in some churches, many churches. It's an old adage, and it goes something like this. The best preacher is one who is poor and humble. The best preacher is one who is poor and humble. Lord, you keep him humble, we'll keep him poor. Now, I thank God that's not true here. As I said at the beginning, this was not a passage that falls into that second category where I have to preach something to you that you need to be doing because you as a church have been extraordinarily generous to me and to my wife. And we are extremely grateful. We take it not for granted 1 minute of any day of the week. Believe me, we feel blessed and greatly blessed and doubly honored, to use Paul's words here. So there's nobody that I'm aware of at Grace Fellowship Baptist Church who's saying this, except maybe Perry. But sorry. The fact of the matter is that the natural response of a people who have received a free gift of God is to say, I want to respond back in the same way that God has responded to me. See, I think that statement that I just made a moment ago, that adage, is horribly sinful, isn't it? Why is it horribly sinful? It's horribly sinful because it does not understand the concept of grace. It doesn't understand the idea that God has blessed us with every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places. What have we received from this God? And the answer is everything. We've received everything. Going to heaven when you die is the tip of the iceberg of all the stuff that God has lavished upon you in His love and in His grace and in His mercy for you, which He had absolutely no obligation to do. He didn't have to give you one nickel's worth of nothing. In fact, He could have just cast you directly into hell and said goodbye, which might have been the best thing He could have done in His own justice. But because He's God who is loving and gracious and merciful, as we sang in that hymn just a moment ago, He has given us everything. So what should be our response? Give everything as we can to this God. I think about the parable of the unforgiving servant that Jesus preached. Remember that parable? About the man who owed $1 million to another man, and this master forgave him his debt, just wiped it off the books, $1 million. And he goes out and he finds another guy that owes him $100. And he grabs him and throws him into prison and locks him up, and the first master that forgave him $1 million says, "You wicked servant, I forgave you everything. You couldn't forgive this guy $100? That's the picture that's being painted for us here by the Apostle Paul in both 1 Corinthians 9 and 1 Timothy 5. We give double honor. We give double honor because of what we have received. Because of what we have received. Now, let me just be more specific here. It's not only because it's the natural response, but because it's part, now, listen to what I'm saying, okay? Because it's part of a healthy, selfish relationship. Now you would say, that's an oxymoron, healthy and selfish, right? But I put the word selfish in scare quotes here. It's part of a healthy, selfish relationship between the elders and the congregation. I alluded to this earlier in this sermon. The desire of the congregation should be this. Your desire as a people, and my desire even as a member of the congregation amongst the elders, should be this. We want these men to teach us. We want these men to lead us. We want these men to shepherd us. We want these men to drive us. To drive us to holiness, to drive us to godliness, to drive us to sinlessness. We want these men to stand over us and push our resistance aside and cause us to turn to this Christ. In other words, we don't want them to worry about anything else but us. We don't want them to worry about anything else but us. Focus on me and my needs. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take care of your needs financially. We're going to compensate you. We're going to take care of all your needs. So you don't have to worry about anything else but keeping your eyes and your efforts focused on us. Now, notice I called that a healthy, selfish relationship. Okay? Because I think it is. It's not a selfish thing in the sinful sense to stand before a group of men and say, I demand that you hold me accountable to this Christ and grow me up in holiness. That's not selfish at all in the sinful sense. No, that is a good selfishness. That's a healthy selfishness. That's the kind of thing of saying, Lord, you've established these men to do a job, so I'm going to give myself to them. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to make sure that the guy that they have set aside from amongst their number, who labors in the Word and gets up there on Sunday to preach to us, I'm going to make sure that that guy has all of his energy focused there. On my holiness, on my sinlessness, on my glory of Jesus Christ in my life. I'm going to take care of all of his other needs. I don't want him working a second job, just so he can pay the bills, because that's going to distract from him being in his office, studying, meditating, praying over me, praying over the text, and then coming out on Sunday morning and preaching. I want to make sure that there's nothing else that'll get in the way. See? That's a healthy selfishness. That's perfectly fine. In fact, I think that's the kind of selfishness that God would look at and go, yes, that's what I want. But thirdly, it's also a part of the symbiotic relationship between the elders and the congregation. Let me tell you this. On behalf of the elders and those of us who strive under the qualifications of 1 Timothy 3, those of us who are utterly convinced of what Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 9 when it comes to this job, this kind of attitude from the congregation drives him to work harder to meet those needs. It's a cat chasing its tail problem, isn't it? When a congregation starts focusing only on itself and doesn't really care what's going on in the pastor's life, the pastor then drifts away from it. But the opposite is also true. When a congregation says, we want you to focus on us and only us, and we're going to take care of every one of your needs, guess what that does to the true 1 Timothy 3 man? He says, I'm going to work even harder. I'm going to work even harder towards your holiness. That's that symbiosis between the two, the congregation and the elders, that mutually beneficial relationship where you do your part and we do our part and produces a whole. That's what drives the 1 Timothy 3 elder to do his job. That's what drives me. I spend every weekday here reading these passages, thinking through them, meditating on them, praying over them, reading a lot of other stuff that might go with it, figuring out, begging the Lord most of the time to put some sort of thought upon my heart that I might bring to you, doing these kinds of things. And it's built on this sense of knowing that you are standing there saying, we're going to take care of your needs, you take care of ours. And you have taken care of our needs so well that it drives me to want to try to take care of yours. That's what Paul means when he says give double honor. He means give to these men an honor that drives them to do their job. Give them the kind of honor that says, we know what your job is supposed to be, so do it. Do it. We'll take care of all the little details. You do your job. Men who aspire to the office of elder are not aspiring to some sort of status position or class. You ask the five of us who are elders, we're not ascribing to any sort of class. We're ascribing to an obedience to this Christ, that you might be grown up in the faith, maturing in the Lord, and becoming more and more Christ-like day by day. That's what we're doing. That's what we strive to do. And we thank you for the double honor that you give us to do so.